Hello, this is my summary of my lecture on the circular economy. It's quite a complicated lecture, but just to, I won't go into defining what the circular economy is because I think most of you by now have a pretty good idea. In China it's called the 3R economy, and it involves recycling and reuse as much as possible. The problem with an emphasis on loops is that a lot of recycling is not really, couldn't be really described as a loop because there is some virgin material involved in a lot of recycling. Also, some valuable green processes involve actually fairly small amounts of waste being added to other processes, such as Venus Ujjwala's green steel process, where essentially you're taking tires, crumbing the rubber, treating them through heat, through chemicals, and then producing steel. But you're only adding those tires to the fuel. You're not just using tires. So this transformation of waste into more useful forms is really beneficial. Loop is perhaps the wrong way of talking about it. What I prefer is Geyer and Zink's term, impact reduction potential, because that's really what you're doing. You are aiming for a circle ultimately, or at least you're aiming to reduce waste, reduce energy use, reduce material use, and to encourage the reuse of these valuable resources within the economy so that they're not lost. One of the problems is you have so many materials now that have very low value, and we'll talk a little bit about this. But generally speaking, there are four main strategies people use to pursue the circular economy. One is designing out waste, toxicity, all that stuff I talked about when I was talking about post-cautionary materials and products, designing those out. We don't need any more plastic bags that last 100 years, 200 years. Servitization, that is shifting to product service systems where instead of owning your mobile phone, you lease it. Instead of owning your photocopy, you lease it. Reforming the market, that is encouraging people to repair and reuse things. And for example, using industrial symbiosis so that in an eco-precinct, somebody making one product, their byproduct, their waste can be used by another company. And this again has a very interesting history, mainly going back to what was going on in Scandinavia in Kalundborg in Denmark, which is the original eco-precinct, if you like. The other one is to increase the cost of producing environmentally damaging goods and materials and energy. And that really has only just started, but we're beginning to with carbon trading and carbon taxation. So none of these really go far enough to decarbonize the economy and dematerialize it. And that's why I keep emphasizing we need to deal with consumption. Consumption won't really change through any of these initiatives quickly. What will happen is it'll slowly change, it'll slowly respond. That is why now you're finding the EU is getting more and more interested in design, in rules around product design, in trying to make sure that people stop producing things that break automatically after a certain amount of time. So there are three paradoxes I also talk a bit about. One I mentioned before, I think, the Jevons paradox. That is that optimization or greater efficiency in design leads to lower prices, lower costs, and this tends to generate more consumption. And the problem with this, it also becomes an incentive to produce more consumer goods for more people. So this is one paradox we have to kind of deal with when we talk about consumer goods. The other one is what consumers think. Consumers individualize their experience of consumption. My green product is greener than yours, So that kind of individualization is a delusion. And unfortunately, a lot of corporations use it in advertising to make people choose products they're selling. and there's a lot of deception involved in this. But really, choice makes very little difference at the scales we're talking about. You know, my habits around drinking coffee, say with a takeaway cup, might be really bad for the environment. And you might tell me often, you say, I mustn't use a takeaway cup. And I don't actually, normally. But if you put that into perspective, there are 500 billion of these being produced a year. It'll make very little difference at all. Yeah? So that's one paradox, if you like, the individualization paradox. The other one, you know, because what we do is we see our consumption in our own terms. We can't see these numbers, these big numbers. They're too big. In fact, even the waste managers find it difficult because the numbers are just so big. Can you imagine 350 million tons of plastic in one place? I can't. You know? But this is the kind of numbers we're talking about. Yeah. So the other one is sunk cost effects. I talk a lot about this in my book, Somebody Else's Problem. But sunk cost effects are the legacy effects of our systems. And these are high carbon systems that encourage us to find solutions using the same system. So instead of finding a real solution, we're forced by the legacy, the fact that people have invested so much money into the system to make something greener or better. Yeah. So in a way, these three paradoxes make it hard to create, you know, solutions to our wicked problems. So you have around you all the time encouragements to consume more. Low prices, deception I've mentioned, the temptation to upgrade to the new, rising social standards of, you know, how we all need the latest and the best. Business models that totally rely on make, use and waste. You know, like Starbucks' coffee I mentioned, you know, the takeaway coffee cup. If they couldn't, they wouldn't be able to make so much money because people would sit in their cafes drinking, so they need to get them out. Yeah, so that is a classic business model of the make, use and waste. Yeah, so there's a number of other interesting issues. Time, consumers' buying power is relative to income, and this is part of the problem. And what happens is consumers have more money so they can control more of what they do with their money. And this becomes a problem for those trying to manage consumption. But what is really useful is to remember that more consumption involves a reduction in time. Consumers have less time, yeah? And they become increasingly restless with their products as a result. So somehow calming down the cycle of consumption becomes an important strategy. Space. Very important to provide spaces where consumers don't need to consume. That is, nice, well-designed public spaces that aren't just all shops. Because what you do is then you allow them to enjoy being with their friends, relaxing without feeling obliged to go and buy something. And this again is very important. So quality of public space becomes a very important way of, in a way, preventing overconsumption. Regenerative design is also very, very important. Reducing the speed of consumption, creating value through quality user experience, changing the role of technology to enhance the quality of life rather than simply to make you buy something. Restoring and reviving public space, common goods, such as putting in water fountains in cities. Cities where the water quality is good. Why do you need to take water bottles around? You know, creating quality time to reduce this sense of needing to do the next thing faster. Yeah. So engaging with nature is another one, and designing slow circular business models is critical to reducing consumption intensity. Farmers markets are a good example of this because you're still consuming, but you're taking more time, you're enjoying yourself more. Designing for longevity and repair. Take any old object and you'll see what I'm saying. Why not make objects last? Why not make them beautiful? Designing with nature, place and culture. Why knock down some lovely old building simply because somebody very rich, like Mr. Trump, wants to put up a tower? You end up ruining that place. You might make a few apartments for some very wealthy people, but that place, its memories, that culture that is embedded in that place is gone forever. You can't get it back. You can't turn it into a Disneyland. Get it back. So I then talk about a number of things, but ultimately I end up talking about post-cautionary, an end to post-cautionary design, and how design needs to be reconceived through a more relational approach. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you come across some of these very complicated, wicked problems that we'll be looking at, you need to think in terms of a relationship, not in terms of just the product, like this. You need to think in terms of its impact. You need to think about people. You need to think of the producer, the government, the environment, yeah, and perhaps animals and birds that are affected by it. And this is particularly true of plastics. If you want to see a really sad film, look at Albatross by a guy I know who's a photographer. It's incredibly sad because albatrosses are being poisoned, being maimed and killed by the plastics that are now floating in the sea. So why we talk about this relational form of design, sometimes called co-creation, is that rather than saying the designer knows everything, the engineer knows everything, we need to get the right people around the table to look at the problem, particularly the end user. Who's going to use this building or space? We need to talk to them. We need to find out what they would like. And we need to then develop perhaps models that will enable them to envisage the kind of changes that are available to them. A good example is the High Line in New York, which I showed you pictures of. An abandoned railway that was an endless problem to the local people because of the drug problems that gathered around it, the crime that gathered around it. Now it's a beautiful linear park that everyone uses, a public space. It's not an object of consumption, but it has transformed a whole area. Now the apartments around it are going up in value. So that kind of thing. I've been using this a lot in my teaching. I have a PhD student who is trying to develop solutions in hospitals for communication between children and doctors. And she was using visual cards, little cards, and I showed these in the lecture. These little cards were really designed using co-creation methodologies. So learning about co-creation is actually really quite a valuable strategy for developing ways of dealing with some of the wicked problems, yeah, that we've been talking about. Okay, thanks.